Welcome, everyone, to our webinar today on County Budget and Finance. I'm Jeanette Stanziano, Director of NYSAC's Department of Education and Training, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Honorable Martha Sauerbrei, NYSAC's President, Stephen J. Aquario, NYSAC's Executive Director, and the NYSAC Board of Directors. Welcome to county government and congratulations on your election or appointment. NYSAC welcomes you as a member to our association today. NYSAC's mission is to represent, educate, advocate for, and serve New York's counties and the thousands of elected and appointed county officials who serve the public. As the voice of county leaders throughout New York State, NYSAC is steadfast in communicating the needs and recommendations of our county officials to state lawmakers. Local government is at the heart of New York State, and NYSAC is proud to represent the counties and their elected and appointed officials throughout New York. Please note that we have 3 more trainings every Thursday through February 3rd that you can participate in on other vital topics for your consideration. Please visit the NYSAC website at www.nysac.org/webinars for more details and to register. We hope that you find today's training thorough and insightful as you begin your commitment to county government. Just a couple of housekeeping announcements before we begin. We will be recording this program and posting the recording with a PDF of the slide deck on NYSAC's website later this afternoon. Just go to www.nysac.org/webinars and just look under today's date and you will find the recording and the PDF. We'd also like to encourage you to submit questions anytime throughout the program, but we ask you to do so by using your webinar dashboard. Just click on the questions tab, type in your question at any time, and we will go through all of the questions at the end of the program during Q&A. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. Our first speaker will be Ian Coyle, County Administrator and Chief Fiscal Officer for Livingston County. Ian is the County Administrator for Livingston. He has a BA in Political Science from St. Bonaventure University, an MPA in Local Government Management from the University at Albany, and as an ABD in the Doctorate of Public Administration program at Valdosta State University. Ian also consults regularly with municipalities and counties on executive search and talent acquisition through his firm, Academic Partners. He teaches leadership, ethics, management, and finance courses for a multitude of MPA programs nationwide, including Northern Illinois University, California State University, Dominguez Hills, and Northeastern University. Currently, Ian serves on the boards of the National Association of County Administrators, the New York State City and County Management Association, and the Finger Lakes Area Counseling and Recovery Agency. We are grateful to work with Ian frequently on trainings of this type, and we're happy to have him with us today. In the last third of the program, staff member Dave Lucas, who is NYSAC's Director of Finance and Intergovernmental Affairs and the New York State Association of Counties, will also be speaking. Dave has been involved in state and federal local public policy for over 29 years. More than half of this time, he has been focused on a number of topics that the impact of the federal budget policy on state and local government operations. Since 2010, Dave has helped NYSAC develop legislative and budget policy priorities in Albany and Washington, D.C., as well as coordinate NYSAC budget and economic research activities. Prior to joining NYSAC, Dave was a deputy director of Governor Schwarzenegger's Washington, D.C. office, where he served as the governor's federal, healthcare, tax, and economic policy advisor. This followed nearly 10 years of service with the New York State Division of Budget, where he acted as an advisor to the budget director and governor's office on federal budget and policy issues. And now I'd like to hand over the presentation to Ian Coyle to begin today's webinar. Ian.
Thank you, Jeanette. Appreciate that. Thank you for the welcome and the introduction. And I join NYSAC in welcoming all the newly elected officials or elected officials looking for a refresher, or newly appointed officials or appointed officials looking for a refresher. This is what we're going to cover today. This is sort of the table of contents. In part, I want to begin with this to relay to you what we're going to talk about, but also to indicate in many of these slides, there's a lot of text. I'm not going to be reading the text verbatim. What I'm going to do is read some of the text, sort of build off of those points that are in bullet form, and really those are the PowerPoint's built in a way that you can sort of take it and run with it and access it later on, and that's why it's kind of written in a text kind of based format. So I just wanted to alert you that hopefully this will not be death by PowerPoint to you, and I will do my best to make it informative and fun and entertaining, and at the end allow for some time for questions. So Jeanette, if you could go to the next slide, please. So the budget officer in county governments differ. So just very briefly, there's 57 counties outside of the boroughs of New York City. Those counties operate in various forms of government, from a county legislature to a county board of supervisors. And the budget officer also differs by county. It can be a part-time position. It can be a full-time position. It can be embedded in the position of a county administrator, like it is in Livingston County, or a county manager. Can be a commissioner of management, budget, and finance. So it definitely differs. But one thing that is similar and the same in each of those instances is the sort of the many constituencies and stakeholders that the budget officer has to account for when he or she is doing the work of production and publication of a budget. So I liken this to the bus driver, and as you pick up people that are riding the bus, everybody has the ability to sort of do the old pull cord and stop the progress on the bus. And the bus is going toward a path of, prudent, practical, responsible budget making, and that has the opportunity to get derailed, minimally have an opportunity to have additional people come on and off that, progress train, to include your stakeholders, your community residents, your activists, your department heads, your certainly the elected officials, appointed officials, county staff members, state and local leaders that are not affiliated with the county but impact and affect the county government and its budget. So really just the purpose of this slide is to indicate that the budget officer has a very broad and defined and important role to play, and in doing so is also trying to juggle a lot of constituencies that are really wanting usually more from the budget for the following year. So next slide, please, Jeanette. I now want to talk a little bit about the county budget cycle, the state budget cycle, and how this impacts, probably negatively, but impacts nonetheless the budget work. So just from a timetable perspective, this slide has different dates in it, you can see, but and you don't adopt the budget from December 2013. It doesn't take 7 years to adopt it, so we have a slight change there. But really what the county government budget officer is doing, likely in the summer, some places start a little bit earlier, but we're on a calendar year budget, so that's first. Calendar year budget means just that. The budget runs from January 1 to December 31. And so sometime in the summer, that budget officer is going to be working with department leadership, other staff members, certainly the legislature or the board of supervisors, to start in earnest getting estimates in hand, starting to formulate what revenues look like for the next year, plan goal setting exercises, what we want to fund, what we don't want to fund, how do things look, how are things tracking. That would be in the summer. The run up in the fall is the actual production of the tentative budget, which is a formal process. It has to include certain things and look a certain way. And that gets vetted and analyzed and assessed by the board and other people. There's public hearings. And then you adopt a budget by middle to late December. So usually you're probably in November, early December when you adopt. And then you carry out the budget. which is execution. So you have a budget is just really a best guess at the time of how things are going to look and operate and feel from a financial standpoint for the next year. So that cycle of time is the execution, and what does your budget to actual performance look like? You end the year, and then you look at sort of post-budget, the audit, the review, the assessment, how things went. So this is sort of a traditional budget cycle for a county, for the various stages, and how my point here is it's aligned with a calendar year. Next slide, please. Whereas the state budget cycle is a different fiscal year that runs from April to March. So the state has a formulation cycle that is in the, basically we're done and they're starting to formulate. They adopt if they're on time, and they've had their challenges as a governmental entity and adopting budgets on time, but they've been pretty good the last few years. They have to adopt by the end of March, and then their fiscal year starts on April 1. So their execution runs from April 1 through the following March. Why is that difficult and different? It's different for the county for various reasons, but it's difficult because so much of our budget is reliant upon state interaction. So that's state mandates, state revenues, state decisions, just from a fiscal perspective, not necessarily from the mandates we're dealing with on other executive orders and the like. So if you have a budget that we go to the next slide, Jeanette. If you're looking at your budget as a county government official and you've now adopted it, you were looking at estimates in September, October, November for what you think or what you thought at the time the state was going to provide you in terms of revenues. You might also be budgeting for a sales tax as if your situation related to sales tax is not going to change in the calendar year that you're budgeting for. And as we've seen with county governments, the state has at least recently taken 2 measures to withhold sales tax that otherwise would have been provided to the county government. So just a sampling of a couple of things that can happen in that short period of time. So minimally, though, you're estimating for expenses and you're estimating particularly for state revenues. So the state might say you have to deliver this particular public welfare social services program, and we are going to supply you 70 cents back on the dollar for every cost incurred. So that's your budget, and it could be in the millions of dollars gross. And in the budget adoption by the state, they do some maneuvering and they have to balance their own budget, and they might do so partially on the backs of county taxpayers, and by doing that, spread it around to all the counties, and that 70% might be 65, 62, 60, whatever the case may be, and that in turn your budget is sort of thrown out of whack a little bit before it even starts, or midstream even, when you have a quarterly activity in that calendar year. So you're already into April and May. The state just adopted in April. They make it retroactive to January. So just the purpose of these couple initial slides on the budget cycle are to relay to you that there is definitely a challenge in having the 2 of them being different, and also to relay that we have a heavy reliance on the state as it relates to our own county budgets. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about what I define as a good budget process. Next slide, please. So a budget process can look a lot of different. It can be short-sighted. It can be built on shoddy forecasts. So this is sort of setting, hopefully, particularly the newly elected officials, hopefully setting them up for some considerations to make as you embark on your first budget process, or maybe you just finished one of your next budget process. The first thing is a long-term perspective. So looking out in the out years and making things and decisions and making budgetary decisions with a long-term perspective. That's very important for the success of your county government. Also, goals. I mentioned goals a lot throughout this presentation. And by goals, I mean, what are the initiatives and goals just organizationally, community-wide, county-wide, forget about the budget, that you want your county to pursue and accomplish that next year? And then off of that, what is and where is the budget relationship to those goals? So oftentimes that's a strategic plan, and acutely the strategic plan might even have elements related to financial improvements, et cetera, but it might have elements like community and economic development, housing and initiatives, public welfare endeavors, criminal justice considerations. How do those goals link up with the budget? So that is a good budget process. If you focus decisions on outcomes, that's also important. Stakeholder involvement is critical. I mentioned this a couple of different times in this presentation because of my personal emphasis on this and our personal emphasis on this in Livingston County. I believe it's a sort of a must-have, which is the promotion, not so much in a marketing rah-rah, this is how good we are, but just the communication to your residents and your taxpayers and your visitors of what you're doing with the dollars that you collect from them, really compulsory. So you're demanding that they have a tax bill, they produce a tax bill, it comes to you. You're the custodians and the stewards of those tax dollars. How are you telling your public that how are you communicating with your public, and what are you telling them that you're doing with those budgetary dollars? Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through a kind of a 101 budget just for simplistic purposes. If you go to the next slide. So this is just an example, a sample budgetary document in draft form that would be being produced by a county. So there's hundreds and hundreds of line items in a budget, and they all kind of roll up into a summary document at some point in time. You've probably seen something that looks somewhat similar to this. But the reason why I bring this slide into the fold is to talk about how simple really a budget is. A budget is no different than a household budget at the personal residence side. You have income coming in, you have appropriations, which are basically spending, expenses, and then there's a difference there. And in the world of county budgeting, you have ability to make up that difference in a couple of different ways. So to break it down, appropriations are spending. So all of your departments, we happen to have 32 in Livingston County, all of those departments annually inform the budget officer of the dollars that they wish to spend the following year. They make forecasts, they make recommendations, requests, and those total up to a particular dollar amount. So that's that for us, 168.4 there at the bottom. On the left are just buckets of funds. So this is not to get into the weeds of fund accounting, but those are the funds that support. So the general fund is really just that, anything but specific other operations that need their own fund. So anything that's a catch-all goes in the general fund. And anything that needs a specific separate fund is just that, separated. But you basically have your appropriations, and then you have revenue. So what's in the revenues here? Most counties have sales tax. Every county has sales tax. So you have sales tax coming in. That's a revenue. Most counties have operations that are supported in part by federal or state dollars. So that's also in the revenue. Then you have fees and charges for services and miscellaneous items and other like small taxes and fees. Those all go into your revenue. And then there's a bottom line difference. So there's a difference here where you have your appropriated fund balance. That's kind of a mouthful. That basically means your savings accounts that's been left over for many, many years of operations, and what you have available to kind of fill a hole for the year. And whatever else is left, this is where the rubber meets the road and where your public really gets involved, is your taxes. So 29 million, so let's round up $30 million or so in Livingston County is collected from our taxpayers to offset the cost of our operations. So that's our property tax levy. The property taxes are super important in the budget because everybody talks about them. We have the tax cap, we have how onerous it is to own a home in New York and the property tax impact. I can say for purposes of county governments, the tax rate and the tax levies that you see out there, one, they're highly predicated on the state in terms of the mandated programs. And two, in comparison to what is provided from county government, it's a huge bang for the buck. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a future slide. But last thing on this, and if you just look in 2022 and 2021, you saw the tax rate. I would encourage you all, there's a lot of folks in the county world who talk about cutting taxes. And the tax rate can be cut or reduced, but your tax levy, the total amount of money you collect in taxes, can still rise. Here in this case, we have a tax rate and a levy reduction, just kind of an odd year for us because we had a very good sales tax year. We were able to do that. But more often is the case, you have adjustments to the rate and adjustments upward to the levy. But to break it down one last time, the rate is applied to the home that you own. If you have a $100,000 home and you have a tax rate of $8 per thousand and no exemptions or exclusions, your county tax bill is going to be $800. And all of those collective county tax bills of your 30,000 addresses in your county are totaled up into a tax levy, which in my county for 2022 is $29.4 million. So that's the breakdown. I'm going to talk about some of these elements later on, but that's just, I wanted to begin with that. Jeanette, next slide, please. Sales tax, just a brief note here, is a major revenue center for all of us. How sales tax works, 8% when you purchase something, it goes to the state. They assess it, analyze it. We always joke around, take a little bit off the top, but they don't do that. But they collect it, 8% comes there. They take their 4%, which is the New York State tax rate, and they keep it there. That's statutory, that's in law. And then whatever that local county tax rate, which is anywhere between 3 and as high as, I think, 5, certainly 4 and change, 4%, 4.5, 4.75, that goes back to the county. And then the counties you all differ on how you share it or how you keep it. Some counties have sharing arrangements with towns, villages, and schools, or just towns and villages, or just schools, or the cities, if they have cities, they have certain different arrangements that are built into state law. But the reason for this slide is to talk about sales tax, how important it is. What we've been seeing lately is internet sales tax has increased tremendously as a small revenue center for all of us. Inflation has inflated the value of sales tax dollars, because if you remember, it's a percentage of that purchase, and if that purchase has increased in price, that percentage will thus increase. So you should see some inflationary based income coming into your county based on sales tax performance. And then again, sharing agreements are important because it's gross and net. If you take in gross $40 million, are you really able to budget that? Yes or no? Likely no, because it's some of that $40 million you're collecting has to be distributed downward or distributed to other partners intergovernmentally. Next slide, please. Just briefly here, health insurance is expensive. Of course it is. But health insurance is something along with your retirement costs and your other costs, what I call costs of doing business. As an elected official, appointed official, you should be concerned about when you talk about the budget. You want to know health insurance, how much are you going to spend next year? How many contracts do you have? What's the plan cost per contract? What are the total costs? What's the trend line? Things like that. Should you be looking at different what they call funding options? But again, not to get into the weeds, the purpose of the health insurance slide here is just to show that in an overall budget, there's lots of different cost centers, and one definitely is the health insurance cost center, something to be mindful of, something to watch as far as kind of a pocketbook item. It can really sneak up on you as a major cost center and a cost driver for your overall costs of doing business as a county government, because we're very personnel heavy, because we're a service-based organization. Next slide, please. I talked about fund balance, and again, trying to keep this high level. I just want to emphasize this one more time. Unassigned fund balance is basically anything that's been left over the years that hasn't been assigned anywhere, that is a carryover of either surplus or deficits, basically the surplus or deficits that you've been running as a county government through years and years and years and years, and what's left over. Breaking it down to the household analogy, it's basically a savings account, reserves, set-asides, rainy day funds. It goes by various terms. That basically is what it is. It's there for various reasons. It's there for exigent situations, emergencies, fiscal crises. It's cash flow purposes, because you don't get all your income equally throughout the year, so you may need to have some kind of bridge financing to fund certain things. It also helps your credit rating, which allows you to get lower interest costs when you go out for debt for running operations. So that's just something to account for. You should know what your fund balance is. You should know what the percentage of fund balance is versus what your total operations are, and just something to be mindful of as you go through the budget process. Next slide, please. I'm not going to steal Dave's thunder, but Dave is going to talk, I think, a little bit about mandated programs, so I'll just talk about them briefly. NYSAC did a 9 for 9 campaign many years ago. 9 particular state mandates make up 90% of the local share, basically your tax levy. So if you collected taxes, you have to collect taxes at the property tax level to support your county operations. What the campaign was saying was that 90 cents of every dollar you collected from your property taxpayers for county property taxes were in turn being used to fund the local obligation for state mandates that you really have no control over. The biggest one that makes a lot of news is Medicaid, and Medicaid is a very costly program for all of our county government budgets. As you can see here, when we were doing a brief study here 2 years ago, we were only looking at a handful of programs, not the full 9. And you can see that almost $18 million in 2020 of our $21 million allocation was for mandated programs. So Dave's going to talk, I think, a little bit more about this. The purpose isn't to blame game, isn't to say that these programs are not valuable and worthwhile services to be rendered. They certainly are, but it's about autonomy and control and really direct mandates from the state to say you shall do this, you shall do that, and at times that those directions and mandates and edicts come with changes to our funding formulas, which present a very problematic situation for a county budget when we have a tax cap and we have very tight constraints with our fiscal situation. Next slide, please. Yeah, there you go. Perfect. So just some best practices to share with you as we talk about the actual budget and what I call guarding the public checkbook. Don't be afraid to raise taxes. Taxes are, people think like, oh my gosh, we can't do it, and taxes are already so high. Very likely you have to raise taxes to keep up with the cost of doing business. So I think just don't kind of get into a hole of saying we're not going to do it or no more taxes. I think just being realistic and open and honest and transparent with your public to say here's why, but also here's what you're getting for all of those taxes that we have to raise. Here's all the services that we're providing in the county. Protecting the county's investment in its infrastructure and equipment, just making sure you have capital plans in place, that you're planning ahead, that you're forecasting out trends for your buildings, for if you are in the water and sewer utility business or utilities, if certainly you have equipment that's on the road, your replacement plan for your vehicles, just keeping that in mind. Fund balances, I mentioned that it's very good to have a healthy fund balance, to replenish that fund balance, to use it and replenish it, not just use it and run it dry. Debt is okay. Debt is not the end of the world. You're going to have debt. It's akin, again, to the household analogy of having mortgage debt, perhaps a car debt. I'm not going to play Dave Ramsey and tell you to get rid of it entirely at the county level. You're going to have some debt. Use it prudently, spread it out for future generations of taxpayers. It's important to have a really good sound budget and good finances, because just like a credit rating of 750 or 800 will allow you to have a really good interest rate on your car or mortgage loan, having good finances and good fund balances and good financial practices when you go out to secure a 10, 20, 30, $50 million note for a debt for your county, you will then pay less and save your taxpayers lots of money if you're good sort of like to begin with, if you're doing the right thing to begin with. And then the last bullet I want to emphasize here is educating the public about fiscal issues. It's also educating the public about what's going on in county government. It's telling them what's going on. It's telling them that you have true cradle to grave life cycle services that you provide from A to Z, from birth to death and everything in between. County government's involved in the residents in your resident's life. So what are you doing for that $800 or $1,200 or $1,500 or whatever your individual situation is? What's your average home? What's the average tax bill? And for that $100 a month, what are you able to show to your public that you're providing the public through their county government operation? Next slide, please. And then, of course, you have, those are the best practices. Then you've got things that you really shouldn't do. So we call these the 7 deadly financial sins. I'm not going to read them, but again, I focused early on goals and results. And I really stress this we stress it here in Livingston County is, what are the goals for the year? What do you want to do? Again, irrespective of budget, and then making sure that aligns with the budget, because it also talks about financial goals. Like, we want to have a fund balance of X. We want to have cost containment strategies that look like this. We want to have a 5-year capital improvement plan that has a financial interface. So those are all the goals that you want to kind of set and talk about. The other thing that I want to mention here is spend surpluses and one-time money for ongoing programs. You get some one-time money, those should be used for one-time hits. You don't want to have a non-recurring revenue, i.e. Stimulus, i.e. Some massive infusion of a one-time grant or something like that. You don't want to use those for ongoing programs. Seems like a 101 statement for me to make. It's a no-brainer. Of course, why would we do that? We're going to have problems down the road if we do that. But many times you see that in the local government, county government world, where those surpluses, particularly the state, does this a lot. They really kind of kick the can down the road with the state government, and it comes back to bite them, and of course comes back to bite us. That's all I wanted to talk about on that one. Next slide, please. So just, additional ones to think about. The CPI is not always an indicator of cost. Right now it was running 7%. So, I mean, unless you're giving raises of 7%, you're technically not, for the last year, keeping pace with inflation. But it's not always an indicator of cost and what things are going to look like. Always think about the true cost of employment too. I mentioned healthcare. So when you hire someone, or you're thinking about a personnel decision and the person makes $50,000, realize on both ends that it's not always $50,000. You're going to have health insurance, retirement, FICA, Social Security, training, professional development, workers' comp, disability, whatever cost that could take that to 75, 80, whatever $1,000, or it could be a position that has revenue generation with it, and it could be a net cost to the county of much less than that. So not every position is created equal from a fiscal standpoint or a reimbursement standpoint. And then financial policies is the other thing I wanted to mention here. You should have them. NYSAC probably has templates. Other counties have them. Investment policies. There was just a recent change to investment policy or investment options for county governments that NYSAC fought for and other partners fought for. So take a look at your investment policy. It probably should be updated, but just examples like that. Fund balance policy, budget policy, you should have them and you should enforce them. Next slide, please. These are cutback pitfalls. The times are tough, and times will be tough, and times were tough during COVID. Lots of things had to happen. So my point in referencing all these, and I'm not going to go through them, are that there can be pitfalls in cutbacks. Cutbacks sometimes are necessary, sometimes are okay, but most of these are usually not okay, put it that way. So things like across the board cuts, back to my thing of all things are not created equal. You could be cutting something, cut your nose to spite your face, cutting something that has a revenue generation component to it. Either that position is a biller, which brings in revenues, or that position has a good federal or state reimbursement to it, and some other position has zero reimbursement to it. And then, of course, I mentioned reserves. I mentioned that a lot. You want to make sure you have good reserves. You want to make sure you have ability to fund things on a moment's notice, really. Cash flow, if things go down the tubes like we saw in the recession, like we saw with COVID, you want to make sure that you're kind of aligned and set up in a way that you can withstand some of those things. Next slide, please. And then you're also going to have roles to play with departments, and some departments in your county government are going to be quote unquote more powerful than others, right? They're going to consume more oxygen of the conversation as far as it relates to budget. So, your role is really, and I'll get to the county legislator role in particular, the board member role is really don't play favorites. And my recommendation would be focus on consequential items, not inconsequential items. Definitely press when appropriate, ask interrogative questions, know where the money is going. And then really you're trusting also your department heads too, to do the right thing, to be responsible from a financial standpoint and a budget perspective, but definitely don't do the dance with powerful departments. Treat departments equally and equitably, be supportive, and again, my note here is don't play favorites. So next slide, please, and the next one after that. So segueing into that is the board member's role. So and now I'm kind of speaking just to county legislators or members of board of supervisors. Your role is going to vary depending on how your organizational setup is for your county. Some of you actually might be the budget officer, or you might employ one, so you're sort of overseeing that person. But really, it's the big picture policy plan. So it's the things that you want to plan for, goal setting, initiatives. That's the role of the elected official. The analogy there is the composer and conductor. So the conductor would be an account. My form of government, our form of government, is the conductor starts with the county administrator, and all the department heads are then charged with conducting what has been composed by our board of supervisors. So those big picture policy plans, where we want this county to go. I was elected by the people, and we need to do X, Y, Z. Okay, how do we budget for that? How do we account for it? How do we do it prudently within the tax cap confines? So it's, again, that goal setting, that planning. It's also the macro review, not so much the micro review. I'm not saying that the board members shouldn't be involved in anything they want to be involved with. I like to joke around. We got a 17-member board of supervisors, so I have 17 bosses, including one at home. So I have technically 18 bosses, and those 17 bosses at the board of supervisors here in Livingston County are going to dictate sort of what they want as far as the look and the feel of the budget process. Do they want more data? Do they want less data? Do they want more reports? Do they want less reports? Do they want departmental presentations on a more robust level? Do they not? And then you, of course, would get a budget officer's budget. It's going to be huge, right? Probably, scores of pages, and you're going to go review and comment on that and provide your opinion. Then the committees kind of do their work. Then you do your budget workshops or budget hearing. So you hear from the public. You might do like a road show of sorts to say, hey, county residents, we're going to be in these following town halls to talk a little bit about the budget or talk about county happenings, and we're going to mention the budget. And then you actually do amend it, approve it as a group, as a body, as a collective force, and then the budget gets adopted. And then so the work is that the hard work begins the day the budget's adopted. There's a lot of work that gets involved in the budget adoption, but the hard work is once the budget is done, now you got to stick to it. So back to that state analogy, you know darn well the funny thing about budget is once that budget is done, day one, it's wrong. Moment one, that budget is off, it's wrong, the financial numbers don't add up because it's just a guess at that time, particularly with revenues, less so with expenses, but definitely with expenses too. So it's sort of the oversight, the audit process, making sure you do have an audit, so you audit your books afterwards, but oversight throughout the year. So budget amendments, changes, transfers, exigent situations that happen that you have to then account for and pivot and evolve. That's your role as a board member to kind of provide that necessary governing body oversight to make sure that stuff happens. Next slide, please. So, and the next slide after that, please. So this would be getting a grip on the problem if you have stuff that happens. So talking about long and short-term issues, defining whether it is a short or a long-term issue. So I would say that COVID was maybe thought of being a short-term issue. We were kind of getting through this. We didn't think it was going to be, we didn't know anything, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. Now we're into 2022 budgets and we're still accounting for things related to COVID. So again, just being able to pivot like that, being able to work with your state partners intergovernmentally to draw down necessary federal revenues, which I'll end with in a minute here. But really, I talked about this many times, these one-time revenues that you're going to get that you all got, the state plugged a lot of holes. I know some counties plugged a lot of holes. I just encourage you to think more critically about that in the years ahead, to consider that the one-time money, unless it's for a one-time expense or a capital need or something like that, really shouldn't be used for any ongoing expenses because that it's going to come back to bite you down the road. Next slide, please. And actually, Jeanette, if we could skip that one, please. And then that one too. And one more. Okay, so I want to allow time for Dave and for questions, so we can certainly talk about those things I skipped over. You'll have them on your written text-based document. Just wanted to end here my talk with the 2022 challenges and opportunities, specifically for the federal, specifically for budget and finance. ARPA dollars, American Rescue Plan dollars, these were transformational dollars that came to counties through the efforts of our delegation, particularly New York State, efforts of NYSAC, NACO, and others to make sure those were directly provided to county governments. And it was a huge win. I can tell you that my ARPA dollars in my county were $12.2 million directly, and I can tell you that my impact fiscally was not $12.2 million, to be brutally honest and transparent. So those dollars are going to come to us for, I say they're transformational dollars that, as best you can, try to do some transformational things with them. But certainly do some things that align with the impacts of the COVID pandemic. So things like, tourism, things like employee recognition, or, employee supports, if you will, not necessarily bonuses or hazard pay, but employee supports, or supporting your employee base, economic development, small business support, community development, hard hit areas, and then sort of like big picture planning beyond that. That is both a challenge and an opportunity for all of you as board members with your ARPA dollars. Along with ARPA, you also have a whole slew of other programs that got massive funding allotments. Infrastructure, Build Back Better, this other one that's under consideration in DC that they can't make headway on, but they're looking at. All of those things kind of roll up into a transformational time for county governments in terms of federal funding. And then we just got some flexibility through a different piece of legislation and a Treasury guidance change that allows us some more flexibility with our ARPA dollars. Inflation pressures is a big deal for us. I mentioned that 7%. I don't know what's going to be there after, but certainly it's a concern for us when we talk about cost of doing business, when we talk about gas prices for our fleet, but also gas prices at the pump that we in turn get from the sales tax. Also what we pay our people and the ability to do that, which segues into the quote unquote great resignation, our ability and our struggle in attracting and retaining top talent for our organizations. And that could be from the $18 an hour certified nursing assistant all the way up to the social services commissioner and everybody in between. What are the budget impacts of that? What are you doing budgetarily to align with maybe salaries, to align with how many staff that you need? Things of that nature. Sales tax changes, Dave and company are really on this. It's on the NYSAC platform, on the legislative platform this year. There's two what I call thefts, intercepts for my county, small county, $30 million sales tax, $40 million sales tax collection. That's about an $800,000 impact for us, probably approaching maybe $1 million. So that's a big deal for us. And if we can get that out and removed where it shouldn't be part of the picture, that will be a big win for us legislatively. And then, of course, housing prices have skyrocketed all over. And then you have the sort of in turn issue of assessment and how do you correctly calculate the value of a home, which of course then triggers the overall assessed value that you have, which is the main ingredient for against the taxes, what you collect, tax rate for what you collect in total taxes. So that'll be an issue that comes up certainly for us this year. We have a reval year for all of our 17 towns. They will take homes that are assessed for $200,000 and the market's $300,000. What are they going to do? What's a challenge? That is a significant challenge here for counties moving forward. So I'm going to end there and I'll be around for questions here at the end. So thank you, Jeanette.
Thank you so much, Ian, for that insightful program. Now I'd like to welcome Dave Lucas, who will be presenting on the federal impact. Dave, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jeanette, and thanks, Ian. I'll go over this quickly as because Ian touched on some of this, but next slide, please. As Ian talked about, we are very dependent on the state and federal government in what we do on a daily basis at the county level. We are creatures of the state. Oddly enough, even though counties existed before the state of New York, going back to the king, when New York became a state, it took control of pretty much everything. And they do hand down a lot of different mandates and requirements to county government. It's not just implementing programs, but it gets into, as Ian talked about, the type of health insurance we provide to our staff, how the pension payments are made. A lot of that is governed by the state. And a lot of the negotiations between labor and management are functions of how state laws are written. So it goes just beyond, you pay for this program or you don't pay for this program, and maybe we'll give you some money to pay for it, or maybe we won't. There are other state laws that impact your county operations on a regular basis. So Ian also touched on this timing of the schedule, and we're so closely linked to the state budget and how it can be a problem sometimes when mid-year you get a change because the state budget was adopted and implemented a different change. That really begins, the timeline is very similar at the state level as it is for the county. I mean, they begin their work in the summer and they really ramp it up in the fall, and they're making final decisions November, December on what the state budget's going to look like, because the executive budget recommendation comes out in January. So part of our role at NYSAC is, we maintain regular contact with the state agencies and the state legislature all through the year, and we really hit the accelerator going into the fall and through the year when the state budget's being negotiated. Our priorities that we push at the state level really do come from all of you. Any member of NYSAC, the elected officials, the appointed officials. We have a standing committee structure at NYSAC where we evaluate and talk about issues and problems and develop resolutions. And those resolutions form the basis of our lobbying efforts in Albany and DC. These budget priorities come out, and we encourage all of you that are new or have been around for a while that don't participate on a committee to do so. That can be found on our website. Next. Again, it's the mandate issue. We do have a lot of mandates we pay for. The state doesn't just control how we spend our money in some areas. It also does have control over the revenues we collect as well in some areas as well. The property tax cap, as Ian mentioned, it is a big deal. It does limit your ability as a county to raise revenue on the property tax side. You need to stay within that cap, and most counties do. Sales tax is another one. Under state law, sales tax is becoming a more and more important issue for counties as we try to keep the property tax down. Sales tax receipts have been strong over the last couple of years, not counting 2020, obviously, but they've been pretty strong. Under state law, the county is allowed to automatically approve their own sales tax rate of 3%. Anything above that has to be approved by the state legislature, and we usually get 2 to 3 years, and we have to renew that. So that's another area where the state has some control over what we're doing as far as revenue goes. The difference between New York and a lot of other states is there's a ton of mandates in our state compared to other states, especially for counties. It really does put a lot of stress on the budget and requires counties to do a lot of different things. And the linkage back to the state budget is when the state budget is in trouble financially, it automatically comes down to counties and other municipalities and everybody else that receives any funding from the state. Next, please. There's a lot going on in this slide, but I just want to talk about when there's a lot of pressure on the state budget, what can happen. The chart on the right there in the upper right corner there, we're looking at the state budget and when it's enacted and what happened during COVID financially. So in April 2020, the state's adopting their 2021 budget because it runs into the 2021 calendar year. At that point, they were projecting an almost $70 billion four-year deficit. And within that budget, Ian kind of pointed out this as well, they decided to do quite a few things to state aid that goes out. They cut it by 20% for the year. So that's a mid-year effect that counties couldn't plan for. You adopted your budget in late 2019, and in April of 2020, the state comes along and says, we're only going to pay you 80 cents on the dollar for the programs we're telling you or we're requiring you to fund. So that was a huge impact. There was a change later that 20% withheld was reduced to 5%, but that didn't really happen until 2021. So counties had to deal with that huge reduction. But as you see, as you go down this chart, the deficit, every time they looked at it again and as time passed, it got smaller and smaller and smaller. And then in September of 2021, when they did the second quarter update for the state financial plan for state fiscal year 2022, it's showing a $17 billion surplus. And I can tell you when the governor's budget comes out in January, that $17 billion surplus is going to go up. It's highly likely. The revenue is just pouring in. And a lot of this has to do with, you know, the federal assistance that was provided. The federal government dumped $5 trillion over an 18-month period into the economy. The federal budget is only $4 trillion. So they basically doubled the federal budget in a period of time to deal with COVID and to deal with the economic shock that happened. But that allowed consumers and everybody else to help continue paying their bills. It wasn't a perfect solution, but that money really made a huge difference and allowed activity to continue. So as you know, Ian pointed out, we have this ARPA funding that we need to address now, and that was part of the federal money. So I just want to show that over time, things can really change. The negative situation was very hard going through 2022 for counties to manage. There was a lot of things that Ian pointed out you didn't want to do, but you sort of had to do because we didn't know what the future held. So the link between the state budget and the county budget is, you know, it's there, it's ever present, but it's manageable. Next slide, please. Yeah, this I just talked about this. The 20% reduction, it was lowered, but it happened in a following county budget year. Also, something the state started over the last couple of years was to intercept sales tax before it got to the county. You know, it is a state administered tax. It's all collected by vendors, and then it's sent up to the state, and then the state distributes it back down, as Ian pointed out. But right now, for the 57 counties, we're 110 million a year is being intercepted by the state. And when you include New York City, it's closer to 310 million a year because they're also intercepting. New York City is considered a county for many purposes under state law because we do similar programs. The city does quite a bit more, but they are also a member of NYSAC because we're so interrelated in how we function together. In addition to the direct intercept of funding, the state has also required certain dollars from the sales tax pot to be spent on certain items. This is more a New York City issue, but we're looking at close to $500 to $600 million a year in sales tax, either being intercepted by the state and used for state purposes, or it's being required to be spent on certain programs. So the county and the city, as Ian got back to about, it's not a blame game, it's more about who controls the dollars. We're losing control over some of this money, and it's become a bigger issue for counties over the last few years, just really because of unprecedented fiscal challenges. Next slide, please. This happened also going back to the Great Recession and the 2008 period. The state had it was a fiscal crisis. It really impacted Wall Street, which is a huge generator of cash for the state through income tax and capital gains. There's a huge amount of revenue comes in from Wall Street. And when that sort of collapsed in 2008, 9, 10, they shifted a lot of costs. And for counties, the bill was about $400 million on a recurring annual basis. Sorry about that. So we're always mindful of, recessions happen, downturns happen, and we just need to be cognizant. And this is why it's so important to have fiscal reserves, as Ian pointed out, at the county level. Because I will be honest, the state has done a horrible job at putting aside reserves. They have a $200 billion budget, and they have about $3 billion in reserves. That's not nearly enough to manage any sort of hiccup that might happen. Next slide, please. This is really, Ian touched on it. This is the 9 for 90 schedule, and this goes back to 2012, but it's just trying to highlight how big of a mandate each of these big programs are and their share of the property tax levy. You know, statewide, the county property tax levy in 2020 was about $5.2 billion. That was the total collected from all 57 counties in property tax. And in 2020, we were paying out about $4.6 billion to support these programs. You know, this guides this guides our activity at NYSAC, and the county officials, you know, bring this up to our attention clearly. That, you know, funding these programs is very expensive, and it focuses our target. And Medicaid, we've done a lot with the state. We pay more for Medicaid than all the other counties in the country combined. But in 2012 and by 2015, there was a cap placed on our cost in Medicaid. And you'll see over time from 2012 to 2020, the share of Medicaid against our levy has dropped because the Medicaid costs have been frozen. So pensions is another area where it was a big cost driver, and there's been pension reforms over time, and we're trying to reduce the impact of that. And for 2020, also showing the diversion of county sales tax in hard dollars. It's a revenue mandate in a way, but it's something we have to accommodate in our management of our budgets. I think the next slide. So this year, our top priorities going in, Ian mentioned this too, is, you know, we want to end this diversion of county sales tax. This is sort of, sales tax is used for a lot of things. It helps keep property taxes lower, and it's becoming a bigger and bigger share of most counties' revenues over time. So we really want to end this practice. It's going to be a huge challenge because once the state has the money, for them to give it back, they have to pay for it out of their side of the equation, and it's a very difficult thing to deal with. Also on the Medicaid side, this is a big priority for us. I really can't get too deeply into the details, but the federal government raised their portion of the Medicaid bill. They're willing to pay more of it over time through the Affordable Care Act. And that funding is savings, that federal savings is supposed to be shared with the counties. And for the most part, the state has shared it, but they always hold back a little piece of it. So they've been holding back about 20% of it, and they haven't reconciled what they held back for more than 5 years. So they owe us, counties in New York City, quite a bit of money. We think it's well over $1 billion. We want to shake that loose. It's an administrative action. We're trying to get that money out of the state and back into county coffers. We also think we need to invest more in local health departments for a ton of obvious reasons. The Great Recession led to a 40% reduction in state support for local health departments over the last decade. That investment would have been really helpful. We did a great job responding to the pandemic at the county level, but having additional resources would have probably helped out quite a bit more. And we also want to do some reforms. This is a top budget priority for us, for individuals deemed incompetent to stand trial. And I know we're pushing up against our time, and I just want to see if we have any questions and turn it back over to Jeanette.
Thank you so much, Dave. We have a handful of questions that have come in that I'd like to open the Q&A floor up to you and Ian to discuss. The first question that came in is there a rough percentage of salary to use to estimate the costs of benefits or benefit packages for employees at town, city, or county levels?
Yeah, I can take that one. It's probably something that county can work out with their, so if the town supervisor with the town costs, kind of just doing a quick little, back of the napkin analysis, it's just really the main drivers are retirement costs, healthcare, and the FICA, Social Security, and those miscellaneous ones I mentioned, probably in that range of 40%, but it depends really on that particular person, maybe what tier that they're in, what healthcare package they're going to get. Are they family, single? Are they not going to take healthcare? It differs, but it's probably in that 40% range these days, depending on what the government offers their package.
And a follow-up to that question from the same person is, can counties set policies for how robust a benefit package to offer county employees? And how do such policies interface with contract negotiations, especially for civil service or union positions?
Yeah, so I'll kind of start from the end of that question. So the CBAs are collective bargaining agreements. So they've been collectively bargained for between the union membership and the county in the case of counties. So that group of employees, civil servants, union folks, CSEA often, AFSCME, sheriff's unions, Teamsters, whatever the union is, has said, our 100 people here, we are going to bargain for a package that has all these particulars in it. And one of those is usually healthcare. And it usually speaks to maybe sometimes the type or the substance of the offering itself, like a comprehensive HMO or some wording like that. And then it also usually speaks to the percentages that nowadays that the employees will be asked to contribute. So from a policy perspective, that is sort of what the governing body is doing. They are, quote unquote, setting policy through the agreements they have with unions that they want to allow for or not allow for a benefit level of XYZ. And then the non-union people often usually follow suit, so to speak, or they have a policy that's governed by usually a board resolution or some other department benefit policy that they've been adopted by the board, by the county. And that again will speak to what the offering is from a healthcare perspective.
Ian, this might be another question for you. Can you give a more detailed example of what percentage or dollar amount a county fund balance should be?
Yeah, great question. I've done this presentation for 10 years, and I always get a question about appropriate fund balance because it's really, and I think I get that question. It's a great question. I think I get it because it's such it's a tough one. It's a challenging one. So I'll start with, there is no defined base level percentage of like a must have or a must have nothing more than. So for example, I think school districts have a cap on the amount of unappropriated fund balance. I believe it's like anywhere right around 5% or so of their total, so probably their total operating spend appropriations that they can have no more than X percent. So then you kind of look to, okay, does a comptroller talk about it? Well, they talk about it a little bit here and there when they do audits, but they don't necessarily speak to a defined percentage level. Here's a funny thing about the comptroller's office. They're going to hit you they're never going to hit you and say you're appropriate. They're going to hit you and they're going to say you got too much, which we've seen in places actually had to distribute checks back to their residents. Or they're going to say you have an insufficient level and you don't have enough for emergencies. So I've very rarely seen them saying, hey, you got a good requisite level. I've seen, to answer the question, long answer to the short question, I've seen anywhere between, usually around that 15 to 20% is probably a sweet spot. If you get kind of in the north of, 30, 40, 50%, you're probably too much. And if you get in the 5 and 7% for a county size, I think you're probably too low. And it really depends on what you need it for, what you're using it for, and kind of what happened that previous year that might have spiked it. So hopefully that answers the question.
Also, another question, reserve monies. Which classification of fund balance is that under?
That's going to depend on, I kind of probably inappropriately use reserves interchangeably at times because of the, just the feeling of what a reserve is with fund balance. But reserves can actually be like dedicated, specific, separate and apart from fund balance, where over time through the end of year process, you have literally reserved, you've set aside, you've segregated a piece of your fund balance to a specific thing, endeavor, project, set of initiatives, whatever. So that would be a reserve, and they are usually separate and apart from the unassigned fund balance because these days they are considered sort of assigned if they've been targeted to be reserved.
As county-generated sales tax dollars are theoretically county funds, how can the state legally redirect those dollars?
That's a great question. I think that's why, well, first of all, that's why the fight was so large and loud against it. And that's why it's on the legislative program. Probably statutorily, legally built into the home rule law or lack thereof that we really operate in New York State. I'm guessing, and Dave might be able to impart his wisdom on this one. I'm guessing it's due to something that's in there at the state level that allows for that to happen. Because it has happened a couple of different times, and seemingly they are able to do that.
Yeah, I could just add that it is a state administered tax. The sales tax exists in state law, so it's determined, as I said, the 3% is an automatic allowance for counties to impose, and then above that, you need approval from the state. But it's almost an administrative issue. I mean, New York City established the sales tax before the state did back in the 1930s, and the state didn't really get into it till later. But when they did, from an administrative standpoint, it was just easier to have one entity in charge of collecting and distributing out the sales tax, and that's really where it stems from. But this intrusion into the sales tax had never really happened since over the last 50 or 60 years. When it was broadly imposed at the state level. So it is a huge issue for us, but they do have authority under state law. And, it's not pretty the way they've done it. They write into a bill that we're just going to take X dollars off the top before anything gets distributed back to the counties. It's just the money grab, and they're using the money to fund state programs. So yeah, they do have authority to do it under state law.
So can the county sue the state for the sales tax money they are owed?
Well, technically under state law, the state has made it a state sales tax for the portion they've kept. Suing the state usually, it's a difficult question. I don't have a good answer for that.
My final question that has come in is actually a question for you, Dave. It's more about NYSAC's legislative program. What is NYSAC doing about EMS issues? Rural EMS is being crushed by rising costs and meager Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements.
Dave,
Yeah,
I might be able to.
Go ahead.
Sorry,
go ahead, Ian.
I might be able to handle that one. There is a couple different things floating around. Sorry to interject, Dave, but so particularly rural EMS is something that's a struggle for a lot of communities. You have volunteer corps and other nonprofit corps that are unable to continue to meet the call volume. You have volunteerism that's waned, and nothing against the volunteers, but just maybe the numbers or the training requirements. So you have some impacts there. There is an allowance presently for a county to get a certificate of need, a CON, to operate emergency medical services, aka ambulance, at the BLS, basic life support, and ALS, advanced life support level in the county right now. So Livingston County, a few other counties do that. So we actually have essentially a department, just like probation and others, where you can do that, you can bill back. It operates with a quote unquote net local share, aka deficit. So the county taxpayers have to pick that up a little bit, but that is now countywide coverage to kind of fill in the gaps where there's been gaps created by no fault of their own, some of these issues at the local level. Also, I do know, and NYSAC might know more specifically about this, there is also some legislation floated around. I know Senator Galvin in my area district had asked me to opine on it, which is a ambulance district formation that's being considered. So that was kind of be a separate, I didn't read the whole thing, but it looks like it would be a separate district formation, either in partnership with a town-county initiative, but sort of an overlay taxing jurisdiction district to account separately for EMS and to try to help out rural EMS. But really the answer, even if you get a taxing jurisdiction, the answer is probably leaning towards, unless you have private corporate entities that are able to do it, or a robust local core that's able to do it, or cores, the answer leans in a lot of these places to the county having to get directly involved.
Yeah,
Thank you, Ian.
if I could just add to what Ian said there for a second, there are these special district bills that are out there, and what it would do is create a taxing district separate from what the county had that would basically fund the ambulance or EMS district. And the goal is to make it county-wide, but it has limited support in the legislature at this point, but the bills are out there and they're becoming more of an issue as Ian said, more of the smaller volunteer EMS programs run into trouble.
Thank you, Dave. That concludes our program for today. Thank you for joining the webinar. We'd like to remind everyone to consider joining any of our 3 upcoming programs to continue your training and orientation every Thursday until February 3rd. We hope you enjoyed today's training, and thank you especially to Ian Coyle, Livingston County Administrator, who has actually been one of NYSAC's in-house experts on budgeting and finance for counties, excuse me, for many years. Thank you, Ian, for once again contributing to our training programs. And thank you, Dave Lucas, NYSAC's Director of Finance and Intergovernmental Affairs, for his presentation today on topics that he knows oh so well. I'd also like to thank the generosity of NYSAC's Excelsior sponsors who have been underwriting the entire orientation series. We really appreciate their support, which helps NYSAC able to present these free of charge trainings. That concludes the webinar for today. Thank you and have a healthy and productive week.